She did not scream. That is the detail that survived. Not the weight of the chains, not the crowds, not the slow, deliberate walk through streets designed to break something inside a person before they were finished breaking the body. What the ancient sources recorded, cautiously incompletely, the way men record things that embarrass them, was that she did not look away. This is a story about power. Not the kind you seize, but the kind that is performed. The kind that requires an audience, a captive, and the unspoken agreement that what is happening is not cruelty, but order. What Rome built was not simply an empire of territory, it was an empire of meaning. And among the most carefully constructed meanings in the Roman world was this, that there existed a hierarchy so absolute, so cosmically justified, that a woman who had commanded armies, administered justice across hundreds of miles and spoken with the authority of a God-appointed ruler, could be reduced, deliberately, systematically, publicly, to a spectacle, not as punishment, as proof. The ancient world knew many empires, most ruled through force. Rome refined something different. Rome understood that the most durable form of control is not the fear of death, but the fear of humiliation, the fear of becoming a symbol that others are forced to witness. To understand what happened to the queens Rome captured, you have to understand what Rome believed it was. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, the Roman legal system had evolved into one of the most sophisticated frameworks of rights and protections the ancient world had produced. Roman citizenship carried with it a shield of procedural guarantees. You could not be flogged without process. You could not be executed without tribunal. The body of a Roman citizen was, in theory, protected by the full weight of institutional law. This was not merely idealism, it was the social contract that held the empire's diverse population in alignment, the promise that civilization, at its centre, extended a kind of dignity to those who belonged to it. The operative phrase is those who belong to it. For everyone outside that boundary, for the defeated, the conquered, the foreign-born who had not earned citizenship through service or inheritance, the law offered something different, something ancient, something the Romans had inherited from the earliest written codes of the Republic. The principle that military defeat dissolved a person. That victory in war did not merely transfer territory, it transferred human beings into the category of property, a soldier, a farmer, a king, a queen. Defeat erased the distinction. This was not considered barbaric, it was considered law, and that legal architecture made everything else possible. When Roman officials marched into the Iceni territories of eastern Britain in the year 60, they were not acting in spite of civilization, they were acting in its name. King Prasutagus of the Iceni had died after decades of carefully managed cooperation with Rome, leaving a calculated will, half his kingdom to the emperor, half to his daughters, designed to protect what remained of his people's autonomy. It was the kind of diplomatic pragmatism that had kept client kingdoms intact across the empire's frontier zones for generations. The officials who arrived to process the inheritance did not even consider it. They declared the kingdom forfeit. They seized the estates. They treated the queen as an obstacle. What followed was not an accident of violent men acting without orders. It was a statement. Queen Boudica, who had governed alongside her husband, who was recognized as royalty by the very empire now standing in her hall, was publicly flogged. Her daughters, described in the sources as young and certainly unmarried, were assaulted by Roman soldiers. The historian Tacitus, who was connected to Britain through his father-in-law and who possessed access to military accounts of the period, recorded these events with a directness unusual for ancient writers on such subjects. He understood what it meant. He knew that Rome had violated not only persons, but a symbolic compact, that even allied royalty had limits of protection. What makes this episode so historically significant is not only its brutality, but its publicity. These were not crimes committed in darkness. They were performed. The Iceni people were made to watch. The logic was Roman to its core. Break the symbol, and you break the population's imagination of resistance. A queen is not merely a person, she is a living proof that another kind of power is possible. To humiliate her in front of her own people is to perform the erasure of that possibility, to make the crowd itself a witness to its own helplessness. It did not work. What Rome intended as the end of the story became the beginning of one of the most significant uprisings in the history of Roman Britain. Boudica raised a coalition force from multiple tribes that destroyed 3 Roman settlements, including the city that would one day become London. Tacitus preserved what he believed was the substance of her address to the assembled warriors, not the speech of a queen defending her throne, but of a woman who had been reduced to a body and chose to speak from it. The rebellion was eventually crushed. Roman discipline and tactical positioning, the same qualities that had built the empire, held in the end. Ancient accounts suggest she died by her own hand rather than enter Roman captivity. Her daughters do not appear in the record again. They vanish into the silence that ancient history reserves for people whose suffering has served its narrative purpose. 2 centuries after Boudica, in the shimmering eastern reaches of the empire, a different queen presented Rome with a different kind of problem. Zenobia of Palmyra had done something no other ruler in the eastern Mediterranean had managed in a generation. She had broken away. While Rome was convulsed by the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of military coups, plague, financial collapse, and fragmenting frontier control, Zenobia's forces absorbed Egypt, moved through Asia Minor, and declared an empire of the East that stretched across territories Rome considered its own. She was not a rebel, she was a rival. When Emperor Aurelian finally cornered her forces and the queen was captured attempting to flee toward Persia, the question of what to do with her became one of the defining political calculations of his reign. The answer was the triumph. The Roman triumphal procession was one of the most psychologically sophisticated public rituals ever devised. A general who had met specific military thresholds, victories of sufficient scale, enemies of sufficient importance, could petition the Senate for the right to lead a formal procession through the capital. The route wound through the oldest parts of the city, past the buildings that embodied Roman continuity, up toward the temples that housed the gods who were understood to have granted Rome its victories. Hundreds of thousands of citizens lined the streets, and at the heart of the procession walked the defeated. They were not hidden, they were displayed. Captured rulers were often permitted to wear their royal regalia, their crowns and robes left intact, not out of respect, but because the contrast was the point. A queen in her full ceremonial dress, shuffling in chains before jeering crowds, communicated something that a simple execution could not. She was living evidence, living proof that the empire was total, that nothing, not royal blood or divine favour or the loyalty of armies, could protect a ruler from this. When Zenobia walked through Rome in 274, the chains that bound her were made of gold. The sources are specific about this. Not iron, gold. The choice carried its own vocabulary. The metal of her own wealth and authority had been reshaped into the instrument of her captivity. She walked with the visible weight of her own former power bearing down on her, while crowds witnessed what imperial victory looked like when it was done properly. What happened to Zenobia afterward sits in contested historical territory. Ancient accounts disagree, sometimes deliberately. What appears most credible is that Aurelian did not execute her, a decision that itself carried a message. She had been useful as spectacle. She would continue to be useful as symbol. She was housed in a villa near Rome. Some sources suggest she married into the Roman senatorial class and lived out her years in Italian society, her presence a permanent quiet reminder that the most powerful queen the Eastern Empire had produced in a century was now a Roman social ornament. Whether this was mercy or a more refined form of erasure is a question the sources do not answer. It may not have a clean answer. Not all captured rulers received even that ambiguous survival. For the men and women who were led in triumph and then marked for death, the procession ended at a stone structure built into the slope below the Capitoline Hill, a place Roman sources called the Tullianum. It was not a palace dungeon. It was a pit, 2 chambers, the lower accessible only through a hole in the ceiling, designed for one purpose: to make powerful people die in the dark while the city celebrated above them. Vercingetorix, who had unified the fractious tribes of Gaul against Julius Caesar and nearly reversed the course of Roman expansion, spent 6 years in captivity before being led through the streets of Rome in 46 BCE. Caesar had held him alive for the triumph. After the procession concluded, Vercingetorix was taken to the Tullianum and executed. The man who had come closest to stopping Caesar's Gallic campaigns ended in that chamber. Jugurtha, the Numidian king who had fought Rome to a standstill for years, and whose capture was considered one of the great trophies of the late Republic, descended into the lower chamber, and according to Plutarch, broke. His final recorded words, spoken in apparent delirium as he starved over 6 days in the cold and dark, were a confused observation about the temperature. What they had made of him, in the end, was someone speaking nonsense in the place where Rome put its enemies to forget them. These were not aberrations, they were functions. The triumph, the chains, the pit, these were components of a machine designed to manage the political imagination of both the Roman population and the peoples beyond its borders. What was performed in Rome was watched by the world. Client kings on the frontier understood what the procession meant. Rulers contemplating alliance or resistance made calculations that included what they had heard about the Tullianum. The empire was sustained not only by its legions, but by what those legions made people believe was inevitable. The stone of the Mamertine prison still exists in Rome. Tourists walk past it. Some stop. Most do not know precisely what it was used for, or that the careful cruelty practiced there was considered, at the time, to be the operation of a lawful and civilized state. Rome did not think it was doing something wrong. That may be the most unsettling part of all of this, not the violence itself, but the framework that held it in place, the legal architecture that made queens into property, the ceremonial structure that transformed suffering into civic entertainment, the historical record that preserved the names of the generals and quietly lost the daughters. What we are left with, reading these accounts across 2,000 years, is a persistent question about the relationship between civilization and the systems it builds to protect itself, and who, precisely, those systems are designed to protect. History is not a finished subject. The questions it raises about power, dignity, and what institutions are actually built to do remain stubbornly present. If this kind of deeply researched historical storytelling stays with you, consider subscribing. There is much more waiting in the dark corners of the past, and we would genuinely like to know which figure, empire, forgotten rebellion, or erased story should we examine next. Leave it in the comments. Some of the most important histories are the ones no one thought to look for.